Your baby's mind is growing even before they arrive. The more you talk and sing and play, the more their mind will thrive. You gotta talk with your baby, play with your baby, read to your baby, make out you're a lion. Talk with your baby, play with your baby, read to your baby. Your words will grow their mind.
Well, hello and welcome to the Words Grow Minds Parent Podcast. We'll bring you the experts who can decode what's happening in your baby's brain and give you practical tips on how to nurture them and help them to thrive.
And we promise to do this without adding to the ever-increasing parental load.
I'm Kate. I'm a mum of two and I've been passionate about early childhood policy for over 20 years now.
And I'm Amelia. I'm a journalist. I'm a mum to Grace, who's 5, and Ted, who's 1. And Kate, I'm really sorry because I spilled Ted's bottle all over me today, so I smell like milk. So sorry about that, but that's just my mum life right now.
We can deal with that. Now, today we are talking about the basis of everything that we've been trying to communicate with the Words Grow Minds program, and that is the science of infant brain development. Sounds complicated, but we are very lucky that we have an expert who's going to break it down for us. Because when we were first creating the Words Grow Minds program, we got a whole lot of parents together to talk to them about what they knew, what they wanted to know. And the one key line that they were amazed by, terrified by, and intrigued by was the fact that up to 85% of a child's brain development occurs during those first 3 years.
It is mind-blowing and an underline to terrifying sometimes. Now, the other stat that I've recently learned is that a baby's brain makes more than 1 million new neural connections every second. Every second. It really drives home the message of how crucial the early years are and how we can make an impact to help our kids thrive, because really as parents, that's all we want.
So, to explore the world of baby brain development with us and to really break it down in terms that we can all understand, as this is a pretty complex field, we're talking about neuroscience, but we're going to do it in a way that everyone can understand. And to help us do that, we have one of Australia's leading researchers in the field, Dr Sally Stanton.
Dr Staton is a Senior Research Fellow in the Science of Learning Research Centre at the Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. That is a very clever title. Her research focuses on the role of early education and care settings in supporting young kids' immediate and ongoing social, emotional, cognitive and physical development. And in 2016, she was named among Queensland's young tall poppy scientists for her contribution to science translation and engagement.
Dr Sally Stanton, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the Words Grow Minds Parent Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Lovely to be here.
Well, let's get straight into it. I wanted to start by asking you, we saw some earlier South Australian research which showed that 1 in 5 parents believed that their baby's outcomes were determined by the genes that they inherited the day they were born and that nothing else really played much of a role. Now, of course, we know that unlike the heart and the lungs, the baby's brain isn't fully developed when they're born. Can you maybe tell us what's going on with a baby's brain from the day they're born? What happens in those early years?
Humans are really interesting because we're actually born really, really early in our development. So lots of other animals are born later, and that means you can see a horse, for example, will get up and walk really quickly after, being born. Humans are not like that. We're born very early, which means that we need a lot of support in those early years. But what it also means is we're hugely adaptable to our environment. So what that's created is this opportunity where all of these things are happening in the brain in response to the environment that we're living in. So during those early periods, we're growing billions, literally billions of neurons in our brain, but we're not just creating them, we're also moving them around. So they move around to different parts of the brain that are going to be responsible for different things like movement and hearing and speaking and all of those sorts of language, social development. And then what we're also doing is making connections. So we're connecting different parts up. And so all the interactions that we're having or babies are having as infants are connecting up the different parts of the brain. And the final part that happens in those first 3 years particularly is that we also then start to move away and get rid of those connections that we're not using. And so for babies, the repetition that we have and all those experiences we have over and over are the ones that we're going to prioritise and expend all of our brain energy on because they're what we've told the baby are the really important ones.
So I said a really clever sentence before, which made me feel very clever. 1 million new neural connections every second. What's a neural connection?
So they're the connections between, so we have our neurons and then they have little bits that sit out from those, and each of those connect with one another. And then through there we can send messages. So our brain's like a big electrical system in some way. We can send messages along our neurons and then connect them up. So it's not just the neurons themselves, but it's all of those complex connections that allow us to do all the amazing things we do as humans.
So how can we help, with these neural connections, or is just being part of everyday life enough as well? Like, listening to what you're saying, I'm like, oh God, the amount of times I've, thought my youngest is just sit there while I deal with the eldest. And, is there anything we should be doing in that first 3 years to help this?
I think just firstly take a step back, and for parents, I'm a parent too, I should say. I have got 2 children too. Let's just breathe for a second. It feels overwhelming. Because I think sometimes we complicate it, right? And we think that we have to do all these extra things. Mm-hmm. But actually, some of the most vital, fundamental things that we can do for a baby and that brain development is just speaking to them, being with them, responding to them when they cry. All of those things are telling that baby's brain and that baby about the world that they're living in, so that this is a world where when they cry, someone will respond to them and that it's a safe place to be. And so they don't need to be on high alert all the time. If obviously there's a danger, they'll, respond to that, and that's healthy. And we should respond to things that are making us feel unhappy or uncomfortable. But that actually all of those interactions we do, we don't need to be sitting there with a book reading them, I don't know, some sort of science thing at 12 months old. It's all of those everyday interactions, whether it's around food, whether it's, with a sibling, whether it's, why we're changing a nappy, all of those things, all of those interactions, the eye contact we're having, the physical touch we're doing, all of those things are really, really vital to brain development. And if you are doing those, you are doing a huge amount for that baby.
Can we just explore that a little bit further? So baby's born, the brain's not fully developed. We've talked about how many of those neural connections are made, but they don't just happen. They don't just happen on their own. What is the impact of talking, reading, singing, playing? What does that actually do to the young baby's brain?
Yeah, so those sorts of interactions are what we say are both brain building. So they help build connections. So around language, for example, language is a fascinating thing in humans. We're really well wired to language when we're born. But in fact, as infants in the early weeks of life, we can distinguish, our babies can distinguish every different sound on the planet. So you think of, these languages you get in Africa where they make little popping noises and, guttural noises. A baby will be able to distinguish all of those. What happens across time is that they then attune themselves to the particular language they're exposed to. So for us, if it's English, then all the different specific sounds, they can distinguish those and they get better and better at that, and they drop some of those other ones. So all of that language stuff's really, really important. So that's the brain building part, but there's also the brain protecting part. And the brain protecting part is the bit about the relationship part that we give. And so the responsiveness we have as parents, and please don't take that as it has to be 100%, as best we can, that we're responsive when our babies have needs, that we share joy and laughter or, affection or comfort. Those are protective for our brains because they tell the baby or the baby's brain that the world is a safe place and that I don't need to be on high alert. Of course, the flip side of that is when that's not in place. So if we have a child living in a situation where there's high stress or, lots of adverse things happening for that brain, very appropriately, their brain will develop in a way to protect themselves, which means they'll be, silent if they need to be silent, or they'll, yell out or scream out more because they're responding to that in a way that's protecting them to try and get what they need to survive. So our brains are really just about survival in the end. And what we do with the actions that we have around children is that we build brains, we build all of those connections for the things that we want them to be able to hopefully do as they develop. But we also protect brains by giving them the reassurance or the understanding that the world is a safe place and that I'm a person and this person and there are people around me that care for me. And across time, of course, that develops into really sophisticated things like being able to understand my feelings versus someone else's feelings, and that those aren't the same things.
Is there a way to undo some of that? I know there might be parents listening to that and there has been something that has happened in their lives while their child is 0 to 3, in that 0 to 3 bracket, and it's out of their control. It was high stress. What can happen then?
Absolutely is. So we have neuroplasticity, which is our ability to modify our brain connections throughout our entire lives. So whilst we often talk about 0 to 3, and I have to say as a parent and working in development, I got to about 5 because we often talk 0 to 5. And I did have a little minor panic of, oh my goodness, what have I done up till now? And I can't go back. I can't redo these 5 years. What does that all mean? What I would say is that it's not a done deal. What we have in these periods are really what we call sensitive periods. So these are periods where there is a lot of opportunity to make big learning and adjustments and things. But if that doesn't go right or there's things happening, that's okay because we actually have the ability to rewire brains throughout our lives. It often takes a lot more effort, if you think about, adults who come to realizing they've gone through some adversity earlier in life. It's a longer process, but even young children, if they've experienced something, we can't control that. There will be things that happen. And I have to say that one of the best things I've learned, and I know I'm supposed to come to the end of the talk and say this, but the best thing I have learned as a developmental scientist in the last few years is that there is another sensitive period. So we have a sensitive period around the perinatal period. We have one in those early years of life, so birth to 3, or often we talk about birth to 5. There's another one, and it's the transition to adolescence. So at that transition point, when you're transitioning to adolescence, you have another really, really amazing opportunity to support your children. So rest assured, it does not all end at 5. You can come back and there is time. And being a parent of children right at that cusp now, it is very reassuring to know that I still have a lot of time to be hopefully a good influence on my children.
We've got a chance to right our wrongs. I think that was a really important question because what we found is when we do talk to parents about the importance of the early years, we've had parents come back who've said, well, my child's turning 3 next week. Like, I didn't do all of these things. Yeah. Have I missed the boat? So to know that it's never too late and there's always time and you can always change that course, I think is really important. I want to ask you a question that I don't know that there's actually an answer to, and I apologise in advance for that. But this is another thing that we've heard a lot from parents. So if you need to have positive interactions, talk or read or sing or play with your child in order to support their brain development, how many books a day, how many interactions?
You write a schedule for me.
So we've had so many parents say, just give me the recipe. I want to know that I'm doing it. How many books can I read to get the results, the best results for brains, or what is it? Is there an amount that you can share from your research?
So the answer is no, there isn't. There have been some ones that say, certain percentage of as long as you're interacting this amount of time. I'm not sure the level of rigor behind some of that research. What I would say, it doesn't have to be 100% of the time. It just, please put that out of your minds. All of the experiences we had, as long as you are being there when you can be there, that is really the most important thing. In terms of rules or recipes, we always say it's not a recipe book, it's a toolkit, or it's tools, not rules. There is no set rule.
Tools, not rules.
Yeah.
Great.
Not rules, tools, not rules. Yeah. There is no set formula to any of this. And in fact, there shouldn't be, because whilst we have started this with a real angle of let's not talk about genetics being the big driver, but the social environment, children do bring their own genetics to the piece. Now, that doesn't negate the importance of the environment, but it does make it really important that we respond to the child in front of us. So different children are going to have different levels of interest in different things. And part of our job as parents is to be responsive to that. So look at that child and say, okay, that my child's really interested in this particular area, or really right now, really tuned into moving an object from here to here. How can I make more opportunities to do that? At dinner time, can I let them, touch the vegetables and put them on the plate, because that gives them more chance to practice that skill. So I wouldn't be thinking of it as certainly not a rule or a recipe, but thinking about just the everyday interactions. They are really vital. Every time we, feed our children and we let them pick up an object and put it in our mouths, they are repeating and learning and creating the connections that they will need through their lives. So all of those things I think we often just see as the survival bits or the, care bits that we do are actually really, really vital. And then, of course, if we're talking about food while we're doing, food with children, if we're, down out at the shops and we're pointing to, letters or objects and naming them, all of that stuff we do every single day is the stuff that we're doing to build brains. There's no part of this that, is the perfect recipe for a child. You need to decide what works for you as a family and what the child's interested as well, because the best responses that we get and the most important interactions we have are often those initiated by children. So when the child initiates and says, I'm looking at this, you respond and you name that item or object, you're actually doing a really important role for that child because you're making those connections to the world for them.
Sally, I have one quick question before we're going to go to a quick break. And I just want to go right back to the beginning of our conversation. So we've got genetics, we've got the environment and early experiences. How would you say each of those played a role? How big a role do you think each of those plays?
All right. So it depends what you're looking at. So our genes and our environments differ in terms of their influence on us, depending on what it is we're looking at and also when we're looking. So there's certain things where early on, like sleep, for example, where there's a real genetic drive right at the beginning. And then over time, there seems to be an increasing response to the environment. So it's not a static thing. The other thing I would say is it's a little more complicated than genes and versus environment. In fact, our genes are influenced by our environment. So we now know increasingly about a thing called epigenetics, which means that the actual environment itself will change the way our genes express themselves. So, switch certain things on and off to tell our body what is needed or our brains what are needed. But it also goes the other way too. And I think sometimes this one gets lost in the piece, which is that our genetics also influence our environment. So what the child brings with them also influences how we have to respond as parents. And it's really easy to see if you have more than one kid. Often, if you have one child, you probably get very caught up in the environment as the kind of big driver. Then you have baby number two. Depending on how different they are, all of a sudden you get a reality check and you realise that all those things I was blaming myself for, and maybe all those things I was taking the credit for, yes, I've got a role in that, a really important role, but I don't control it all. And that child, that next child may be incredibly different, even though in many ways the environment that we've created is the same. And therefore our environment changes. The way we have to parent changes. The way we respond to children changes. So it's really complicated and they're never one or the other. And in fact, there was good debate, very hearty debate for many years about is it genes, is it environment? I think most of us just in the end went, it's the wrong question. It's actually a combination of both.
Very good. Well, we might take a quick break and then come back with more questions for our amazing guest, Sally Staton. Stay tuned.
Your baby's mind is growing even before they arrive. The more you talk and sing and play, the more their mind will thrive. Every time you interact with your child, you're helping grow their mind. For more information, visit wordsgrowminds.org.au.
Welcome back to the Words Grow Minds Parent Podcast. We're talking to Dr Sally Staton about kids' brain development, what happens in those early years. And we want to break it down a little bit further, don't we, Kate?
Sally, it doesn't just impact on those early years. The number of interactions, of support, I think you talked about building protection. Can you talk about what impact does that have throughout the child's life once we've got out of the early years and we think we can breathe a sigh of relief? What difference does it make if we get this right?
Yeah, so these are the most fundamental years of our lives. And we have literally decades of evidence where we've tracked families and children all the way from birth all the way through into old age. And what we know is what happens in these early years really does predict and influence. Now, it's not set in stone. There is always opportunity to make changes, but it certainly has a big influence on us throughout our entire lives. So we always think of the early years as really setting the foundations. So if we think of the brain as a house, this is the foundations we're going to build everything else, all those other more complex connections that will develop from 3 to 5 and, through middle school and through high school, all of those things we will learn about about the world in terms of the social parts of the world, in terms of cognition and learning and, the things that we need for education or our work lives, they are all sitting on this foundation of what we've done in those first early years. And so this is really, really vital. What I would say is it's not just about the learning outcomes. It's also about the relationship and the social emotional outcomes. So the relationships that we model and that we create with our children and we often say parenting, but the relationship of a parent is a relationship, and it's hopefully a lifelong one that we establish in those early years, and then we can build on that to have our understanding of how the world works, and we build our other relationships on that. So our friendship relationships build from our understanding of having respect and having people in our lives that respond to us and make us feel good, and hopefully being able to recognise when people don't. So all of those things are established in the early years, and there is absolutely a wealth of evidence that shows that that's the case. Even things like crime rates, incarceration, all of those things can be tracked back to some of the experiences that children can experience earlier in their lives during those first few years and those foundations that we set.
But doesn't that mean that early childhood policies, early childhood supports, family supports isn't just an issue for parents? It's actually a community-wide issue if we're talking about the impacts on employment, on crime, on health, on education.
Again, there is years and years of evidence that shows that it is the best financial investment we can make is supporting children and young people in their early years of life. So governments that do that work, whether that's through early childhood services, through parenting programs and supports, those are, or through social supports that allow families to function the way they need to, those are the things that give you the best investment in people throughout their entire life. So yes, it's everyone's responsibility, but it's also everyone can benefit from it. It's not, it's not just about parents and it's not just about the children themselves, but the whole society benefits when we do this well and in a supportive way.
Now, I know you said earlier, and I love this, and I plan to tell myself this often, it's tools, not rules. I'm going to get that right. Tools, not rules. So obviously there's no recipe. Everyone is different. But what are some things that you want, with all that you know, to see practically parents doing? Just some real basic examples.
Absolutely. So the first one I'm going to say, and it's the biggest cliche, they always say put your air mask on first. I'm going to say no, get someone else to put that air mask on for you, because actually you need other people around you to support you so that you can be available for your children, and also recognise there's a whole community around you, and if you can, where you can. It's not always possible. In terms of the early months of life, so when you're talking about children in the sort of the first year of life, a lot of the work we do can feel like repetitive care things, like, nappy changing, etc. But they are so rich in terms of the interactions that we can have with children. So making the time to actually make those moments matter as much as possible, but also recognise the important things you are doing every day when you interact with your child, even it's just looking at them, touching them, feeding them. All of those things are really, really important for brain development.
How do we add value to those? Like, how do you make changing a nappy a magical moment?
Yeah, so eye contact is one thing, talking, describing the actions that we're doing, but also we could sing songs, we can play games with children during those times, peekaboo, all of those things. Often we're doing them to distract the child from what we're doing, but all of those opportunities are really, really important. So if you can give yourself permission to actually see that as really valuable work, I think that's a big game changer in terms of not feeling like this is just an everyday thing, but actually every single one of those are incredible moments that you are adding to that child's brain. As we go to, as children get older, then obviously responding to children, and we have a thing, you might have heard of serve return interactions, which is this idea that a child serves, and it is usually the child is what we're really looking for. Of course, adults can serve as well, where we say something and then the child responds, or ideally the child does something, like say reaches for an object and we name that object, or we talk to the child about that object and we respond to that child. We do like to see that as extending it. So I have a colleague here that I work with, Sandy Howan, and she talks about serve, return, rally and learn, which means it's not just about the one-to-one serving back and forth, but how do we extend that? And the way we extend those interactions is that we pay attention to what children are interested in. So if we can attend to what a child's interested in, then we're more likely to be able to extend our back and forth interactions. And the more we do that, that can be really, really valuable for children in terms of their ability to learn.
This is our final question that, as we said, we ask every guest. Knowing all that you know, and it's a lot in the field of early childhood development, what's the one thing that you wish parents out there would know?
So the one thing I would say is that there is huge individual difference. And this is the thing that fascinates me about children's development. We often get really, really caught up in this age, a child's meant to be doing this, and why is my child not doing this? And is my child normal? Am I doing everything I need to do? But both the challenge, but the also really fascinating and exciting and wonderful thing about children's development is that every child is different and they do all go through their own journeys. And I think sometimes we get so preoccupied on what we should be doing that we don't take the moment to see the child in front of us and the uniqueness of that child and the importance of being responsive to that child, not feeling like we need to follow a formula of what it is to be a parent or what a child needs, but actually recognizing that it's a relationship, it's a lifelong relationship that we're building with our child that's about respecting and understanding their needs and their own journey and bringing us along with that journey.
I think as a society, we're so used to chasing efficiency and chasing best practice and the ways to do things. But what you're telling us is stop and smell the roses, because this is the one time in your life you want to and you need to.
Absolutely. Smell the roses. But also they might not be roses. They could be some other flower, and that's okay too, and we have to go with that journey.
Go to the florist.
Now, Sally, before I even thank you for joining us today, I wanted to be a bit cheeky and flag that we already know we want to have you back.
Yes.
We know that you are doing some current research on sleep and development, and I can tell you that our listeners will have more questions on sleep than
I have many questions.
Any other topic. So we want to give that the time it deserves. And, of course, we want our listeners to let us know what they want to ask.
Absolutely.
But we can't wait to hear about that. But I just really want to say thank you for providing that background evidence on brain development, what's happening. Dr Sally Staton, it's been wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
Well, Amelia, what did you take away from our chat with Sally today?
Firstly, a huge sense of relief because, when we're obviously talking about doing this episode and how essential 0 to 3 is, I'm sitting there going like, I've already had one child. Let's go through that. Like, have I done enough? And it's this big relief that it is, sometimes we complicate things, and it is those everyday moments, the changing of the nappy, the, dinner time. And even if you're not that present at dinner time, they're still making those connections, whether it's watching mum talk to your older sibling or whatever that is. There's so much more going on. It doesn't need to be these thought-out, orchestrated moments. It's them learning about the world around them and how they adapt to that. The one thing I absolutely loved was tools, not rules. You can't do the hard and fast every single day of your life. That's not possible, and you'll crucify yourself if that's what you're going to put your rules down as a parent to. You just can't be that way. But it's the tools and the things you tap into that can really help. And the fact that, absolutely there would be parents out there who, I don't know, they've gone through a terrible tragedy at some point. They've lost a loved one or whatever, and you can't guarantee life is rainbows and happiness every single day of your life. And there will be times where you're not your best self, and that's also okay because, that in itself is teaching your child something, but there is still moments down the track where you can be aware of that and you can be there for your child when you notice the impact that has as well.
There's no talk about expensive gadgets or, educational toys or the like. It's about you, and it's about you paying attention and responding. And I really took out the impact of those first 3 years. Like, I think the point about, babies are not born fully developed. Their brains are not developed at all. And so much of that is happening in these early years. And I think the really important thing to note is that this isn't just about those early years. What we do and how present and how many serve and return interactions we can have will play a role when that child gets to school, will play a role when that child enters the employment market, will play a role throughout that child's entire future. And I don't say that to put the pressure on parents, but I say that when you're doing the hard yards, when you're singing the nursery rhymes one more time, when you're reading the favourite book that you've read 17 times already, it's actually having an impact throughout that child's entire life, not just their day-to-day.
That's the value to those interactions. If you're trying to, as a parent, do your best and be, I'm going to use this word again, efficient with your time, it's just those little interactions that you really need to put emphasis on, and you're cool.
I hope at least one parent who's listening to us today, the next time they encounter some sort of monster nappy that requires changing,
oh, look at the connections
just remember that is a magical moment.
And now that we've checked off a punami, we're going to wrap today's show. Thanks once again to Sally Staton, and we, of course, will see you all next time for more Words Grow Minds.
Thanks for listening to the Words Grow Minds Parent Podcast. We love hearing from you, so please subscribe, review and comment on the podcast. And for plenty of ideas to support your child's development, go to wordsgrowminds.org.au and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
Your words will grow their mind.